Brigadier General Mohammad Reza Nagdi said of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, said that Iran had only used 5% of its defensive capacity against Israel during what's being called the 12-day war. Your assessment of this situation?
The funeral was a huge vote of confidence. And we have to keep in mind that the West has always been producing a narrative hostile towards Iran in every way or form. Iran is a complete dystopia. It is evil. It is a regime. It is collapsing. It is imploding. It is despised by ordinary people, and so on. And one of the key arguments made by the West is that if we just push it a bit, then it will collapse, and the United States and the Europeans can get a real government, a legitimate government that would do their bidding, like in Syria, for example, or anywhere else in the world where they succeeded in bringing down a government. Of course, I think everyone knows that wherever the United States or the Europeans get involved, it only brings about death and destruction and misery. And the objective has never been freedom or democracy or human rights or anything like that. That is, all of these are completely opposed to the reality of the American empire. Even at home, we are increasingly seeing how the media apparatus is being used to suppress opposition, to suppress support for the Palestinian people, to support a people that are being slaughtered on a daily basis outside of their own countries. Even that is no longer tolerated in the West. So I think it's that narrative, though, has been very important in the decision-making process in the West. And what we saw was the exact opposite. And it is somewhat similar to what we saw in Lebanon. If you recall, after the Israeli regime waged war on Lebanon and carried out a genocidal attack, slaughtering people across the country, destroying neighborhoods, and pretending, the Western media along with it, pretending that these were Hezbollah strongholds or Hezbollah centers in order to justify the destruction of homes and the slaughter of innocent people. Back then, it was claimed after the war, even though the Israeli regime failed to gain any real footholds in southern Lebanon during the fighting itself, we saw that the narrative was that Hezbollah has been weakened, that the people no longer want Hezbollah. Hezbollah no longer has influence among the population in Lebanon. But the funeral that was held for Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah and Sayyid Hashim Safieddin was massive, and that was it boosted the morale of supporters of resistance, not just across Lebanon but across the world. And then we saw how Hezbollah and its allies won the local elections throughout the country wherever they had candidates. Here in Iran, the same is true, although the narrative has even been more harsh and more long-lasting. And I think the funeral was a very important turning point in the narrative, because people across the world saw how the West was lying. Of course, the West will never admit it, that the Islamic Republic of Iran has popular support. We saw the BBC journalist in Tehran, Liz Dasset, go into some side street with where there was no crowd and speak about and give her take on the situation. In other words, she was trying to hide the population from public view. Or the BBC or the CNN reporter who said that there were thousands of participants. I think I did a number of tweets showing bits and pieces of the population, and it was clearly over 1 million. Anyone who knows just Azadi Street, from Engelab Square to Azadi Square, just that itself is more than enough to fill a number of national stadiums full of people. The population was definitely over a million, but again, that's not relevant to and it was very, very warm, and it took me. It was very difficult getting back, participating, especially for people who brought their kids and families. But they all took the time, and despite the difficulties, to participate, and the turnout was stunning. And even though the West tries to hide this population and the magnificent turnout, but I think Iranians and many people across the region and many people beyond the region recognize that these Western narratives are utterly false. So I think that was an important event, like the event in Lebanon and Beirut that we saw a while back. Also, I would say that, so in response to the second part of your question, we have to, and this is something that I think your viewers should keep in mind. The Israeli regime is not Ukraine. The Americans and the Europeans give to the Israeli regime what the Ukrainian regime would only dream of. They give them everything that they have, and they add their own soldiers and their own ships and their own navies and their own air forces to help the Israelis. And then you have radar stations across the region in Turkey, in Qatar, in the Emirates, and in Bahrain, and the airspace of Jordan that's out there. In other words, regional regimes, even those that pretend to be supporters of the Palestinian cause, they're all a part of this joint NATO effort to help the Israeli regime win against Iran and to prevent Iran from striking back. We have to take all of this into consideration. So even when we saw that even air defense systems that were destined to Ukraine, for Ukraine, and supposed to go, they withdrew them and sent them to Palestine in order to help Israel. In other words, the Ukrainians, after well over 3 years of war, despite making huge sacrifices for their overlords in Washington, they were immediately dumped for the sake of the Zionist regime when the Zionist regime needed air defense, extra air defense weapons. So this is what Iran was standing up against, the full force of the empire. So the Russians, they did not have to face the sort of weaponry and this collective involvement to this extent that the Iranians had to face. Yet, despite the fact that this was a blitzkrieg attack and that major figures in the military and senior scientists and ordinary people were massacred by the regime in their beds at home. We saw images of children thrown out of the windows of their apartment buildings, slaughter everywhere. And the West, of course, tried to pretend these as pinpoint assaults and magnificent intelligence operations. So it's like saying that they discovered the home of, let's say, me, and then they wipe out the entire building that I live in order to get me. Whereas my place of residence is no secret, and slaughtering everyone in the building is nothing to be proud of. In fact, it is disgusting and shameful, but that just shows how Western media, how corrupt it is, and how it is simply a tool of empire. As I said, when you look at the CNN journalist and the BBC journalist, both of whom I know speak in this way, it reveals everything, really. So the fact is that the Iranians were up against this massive onslaught, and the Israeli regime had everything, and they used everything. They used a large array of infiltrators, and of course, the entire Western the intelligence community of the West is involved. All these Western countries, just like in Lebanon, they're involved in infiltration in Iran through neighboring countries from inside the country. So they had a large network of collaborators in Iran carrying out espionage and also carrying out attacks. They had the most advanced weapons, and they used everything that they had in this sudden attack. Despite that, after the Iranians had lost many of their senior commanders, most of their senior commanders in the guards, they struck back. And within a couple of days, the tide turned. And ultimately, the reason for Trump's involvement was because the Israeli regime was losing. And even after his involvement, things got worse, as Trump himself admitted, and as Bannon stated, that the Israeli regime was on the ropes. So I would say that this was a huge success for Iran. However, we have to keep in mind that Iran has not used a lot of its weapon systems. Iran has kept many things for a rainy day or for a more important fight. And especially its assets in the Persian Gulf have been untouched, those assets that would be used against the United States, but also key assets and missiles and weapons that can be used against the Israeli regime have not yet been used, whereas the Israelis gave it everything they had. So while I expect another attack from the Israeli regime, and while I expect Western regimes to endorse such aggression again and again and again, wherever it's carried out, I think that next time around, the Iranians are going to be much more tough with the regime, and they're going to give out much more punishment. Now, some say, why should Iran wait for the regime to attack? There is a good argument to make for that. Of course, when the regime carries out these unprovoked attacks, they have a certain advantage. But the calculation in Iran is that when the regime exposes itself to aggression to the world, it only delegitimizes that regime further. And it delegitimizes the Western empire further. When people across the world see how the Israeli and American regimes bomb civilian nuclear sites that are under International Atomic Energy Agency supervision and hypothetically risk contaminating cities with radioactive material, yet the International Atomic Energy Agency refuses to condemn it, and Western regimes support it, I think that is itself incredibly damaging for the empire, even though there are certain risks, even though damage is done. But I think that today it's universally acknowledged that people across the world see Iran as the moral actor and the Israeli regime as immoral and the empire as immoral. Today, we see that all the narratives that were built against Iran for over 45 years by the West and these oil and Arab gas rich Arab dictatorships in the Persian Gulf region through their huge networks of media and propaganda, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and so on, all of these have collapsed. And those regimes that pretended to be supporters, or those politicians who pretended to be supporters of the Palestinian people, yet collaborated with the Israeli regime, all of them have been exposed. And the axis of resistance has been revealed to everyone across the global south, in the region and beyond, as the real moral actors. So I think that Iran's behavior, while it has certain disadvantages on the battlefield, it has created a huge wave of support, despite the fact that Iran is terrible at soft power, despite the fact that Iran does not have strong, good soft power capabilities, and despite the fact that Iran's soft power capabilities that are not very effective are all sanctioned. Despite all that, today we see the sympathy for Iran, the support for Iran, and the axis of resistance, and the Palestinian people today is greater than I've ever seen in my life.
You know, I have a lot of people who come onto this channel who watch this program. They get very concerned about Iran's future. Some people even claim that Iran was exposed and very vulnerable. What's your take on the situation in the context now that we are days, weeks now moving into a week plus into this so-called ceasefire of this, what many Iranians are saying are a big victory over Israel?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that we have a ruthless and very, very powerful adversary. And we're not talking about one regime or one state. We're talking about, you know, the whole West in a way. So I heard this quote from one of these German politicians that Israel is doing our dirty work. And it was really, I mean, mind-boggling for me. Why should any sane and moral state have any dirty work to assign it to another regime? So the reality is that this is not a symmetrical confrontation. We know that materially we are not as powerful as they are, but the important point is that when you have values, real ones, not the ones that you boast about, just to use them as tools to subjugate other people, when you really have values and when you really have morals and you stand up for them, that will determine the fate of the conflict. So although materially we might not be as powerful as our adversaries, I think Iranians have never lost hope. The first strike was a very kind of it came to an extent as a surprise, and it was a very strong blow. We lost many important generals, and I think the Israelis and the Americans expected Iran to collapse after that. And I think that's the power lies in the fact that regardless of all of that, Iran was not only able to just stand up and survive, but also to strike back. If Iran didn't have an effective response, as some people are trying to downplay Iran's, the power of Iran's missiles, if it really wasn't strong, we still would be in the middle of the war. So the reason why the war only took 12 days, as Dr. Marandi stated, and as Trump has in different ways signaled this, was that Israel was not able to take it anymore. So I think that's very important to consider. Another issue that I wanted to point out, a bit related to your previous question, is that for many years the Israelis and also the Americans, but very specifically the Israelis, have been trying to, in a way, construct a false dichotomy of people versus government in Iran, to just try to demonstrate or try to prove that there's a kind of this big divide between what the people say, what the people want, and what the government is doing. The values are different. These are against each other. Israelis are supporting and sympathetic to the Iranian people. And I think the biggest outcome of this war, from the perspective of Iranians, and I mean I'm referring to the non-military aspect of the conflict, is that this whole construction collapsed. Even if anyone before believed that there is this kind of difference, there is this kind of, as I said, dichotomy between the people and the government, when you murder generals and scientists and children and women and people who have absolutely nothing to do with anything political, people who ideologically might not even be that much supportive of the Islamic Republic or revolution. People are just, going on with their normal lives. All of these people are murdered without any reason, and then they call it precise attacks, targeted assassination, these types of things. That really, in effect, makes that false narrative collapse, and I think that was very important. And so the procession, I attended that with my 3 kids, and it was such a difficult day for us because it was so hot and it was so many people on the streets. We were not able to get to Enqilab Square, which the procession started, because of the traffic. So many people were going that direction. So we decided to go to the end, which was Azadi Square. And again, it was so busy and so many people, everyone coming with families, not just, the whole families. And it was really an emotional moment as well, I think. And I was watching the procession. The last convoy that was coming was carrying small coffins, and the photos of the children. And I was just thinking, yeah, the father was a nuclear scientist. So what? Since when is murdering nuclear scientists or any type of scientist in any country something legitimate? How can you? Or they've attacked the Iranian TV station, and now they're just debating about whether it had any military aspect or not. I mean, it's just it would be funny if it were in another context. It's ironic. And we've seen all of these arguments before about the things that have happened in Gaza. They hit the hospitals, they target the journalists, and all of this have happened for other countries. But the difference is that in the case of Iran, they get a response for what they do, and I think that's very significant. And I think this would make the Israelis think twice about what they're doing in the region in the long term, of course. But still, you see, they're bombing again Lebanon and bombing Syria. So what's if Israel? Well, they pretend they are a regime. They are an illegitimate settler colonial regime, pretending to be a legitimate state. But what kind of a legitimate state attacks all its neighbors and goes on to attack the countries that are not even its neighbors? They don't share any borders with it. Constantly in war, constantly fighting and killing other people. And right now, I mean, the people from Gaza waiting to receive aid from the only organization that the Israelis allow for them to enter aid into Gaza, and they're just killed waiting to receive that. So I think not only for the Iranian people is this being more and more clear and clarified, that these constructions, these images, these narratives that the Israelis, that the Westerns are constantly pumping into people's minds are not going to work anymore. Like what happened in Britain, it was in a kind of a concert and people shouting death to the IDF. I mean, why are people surprised about that? It's only natural, I think.